What would a US debt default mean for the US economy? What would it mean for the government? And indeed, what could it mean for businesses around the world, maybe in the US, also in South Africa? Well, joining me to unpack for our CRA discussion this week is Nicholas Babaya. Nicholas is a former CRA colleague of mine, and he's based in the US, currently doing consultancy work. Nicholas, thanks very much for being with us. I hope your weather is a little bit more bearable after what you've had to endure in the last few weeks. But looking to today's issue, just unpack for us a little bit where we are at the moment. It seems like Speaker Kevin McCarthy is perpetually in Capitol Hill, speaking to President Biden, trying to figure out if Republicans and Democrats can agree on raising the US debt ceiling.
Yes, Chris, thanks for having me on. And I think what's important to just consider here for a moment is what exactly are we talking about when we say this debt ceiling, right? Because I think there's a bit of misconceptions about this. So essentially what to understand is that this is a legislative mechanism by which the Congress restricts the Treasury from raising funds through debt beyond a certain point. This was put into place, I believe, back in the 90s. I stand to be corrected on that. But Congress passes a budget. The president signs it, and that then allows the Treasury to spend the funds in the budget and make up the deficit of the budget through government debt. However, this can only be done to a certain point. Now, raising the debt ceiling typically happens quite often in the United States when the party in power of Congress and the White House are the same. This is done on a regular basis without much controversy. But when you have divided government, as we have in the US right now, where the Republicans control the Congress and the executive branch is controlled by the Democrats, the debt ceiling can be a very, very strong tool with which the opposition party can use to bargain with the party in power. And the reason for this is that around January this year, the US Treasury announced that they had hit the debt ceiling and they had begun to implement what they call extraordinary measures in order to continue making all of their payments without defaulting. And what this basically means is that the Treasury's constantly has tax revenue coming in and constantly has expenses to pay out. Everything from federal employees' salaries to contractor payments and so forth. And then on top of that, it also has interest on government bonds and bonds that mature over time. So it has to make all of these payments. And these, what they call extraordinary measures, can only continue for so long because the government is perpetually in a state of budget deficit. So what this has then led to now, just to understand where we are, is Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, has stated that probably around early June would be the worst case scenario in which the US Treasury just can't do any of this accounting magic anymore and will be forced to default on its debt. And that is the scenario that really no one wants to even think about. So what's currently going on is that the congressional leaders are discussing bases for raising the debt ceiling. And hopefully they can do this in time before a default. So that's where we stand.
Now, Nicholas, as we're recording this on the 24th of May, of course, by the time the video comes out, this could have all been resolved. But I want to figure out a little bit about how can this situation be avoided? What could be happening in these discussions between the different players? Could there be legislative processes? Could there be a nuclear option, as it were, sort of radical step? What do you think in terms of the possible solutions? I mean, even those that might not be considered in the normal parlance of, resolving a debt ceiling issue.
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. And I think given how high the stakes are when it comes to defaulting and the negative economic impact that would have, there's been some very interesting and unorthodox methods suggested by legal scholars and economists as to how the executive branch of the US government might avoid this. One option that they've had is for the Treasury to mint $1 trillion coin. So this came from when somebody discovered a legal loophole from a piece of legislation passed in the 90s that stated that the Treasury may mint commemorative platinum coins of any denomination. And the theory is that Treasury could just mint $1 trillion coin, deposit it into the Federal Reserve, use that to fund operations until Congress sorts their stuff out. And once that happens, take that coin out and then melt it down so that it wouldn't have an inflationary effect. This sounds a bit quirky, and Janet Yellen has expressed she's not very keen to do this, but it has received very serious proponents. There was at one point a hashtag mint the coin on Twitter, and I believe during a previous debt ceiling crisis, whether it was back in 2013 or a little bit more recent, economist Paul Krugman said that he was in favor of doing this because it was preferable to defaults. One other option is that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution states that US public debt shall not be questioned. Those are the words. And some have interpreted this as being to say that the debt ceiling legislation itself is unconstitutional and that the president should just unilaterally raise it and order Janet Yellen to keep issuing more debt. This would inevitably lead to a Supreme Court decision. And I don't think that's a very good solution either, simply because it'll take a lot of time. What's most likely to happen is that you'll have some sort of a temporary suspension in the debt ceiling. It's now getting very close to a possible default date. So the time is really ticking out. And I think that default is something that's highly, highly unlikely, just given the huge economic negative impacts that it will cause. So what you're going to have is a bit of hand waving for the time being. But at the end of the day, I think both congressional leaders know that default's very much off the table, and they'll try and buy some more time in order to keep negotiating until they can reach an agreement.
I was going to try and put you on the spot and ask what you think is going to happen, but you've preempted that one, so we already worked it in. So then an actual final question, as it were, in terms of the implications, should the government run out of money, to put it in sort of basic parlance, and this deal not be reached, what do you think of the possible implications for businesses?
Well, I think, like I said, I think a default itself is quite a low possibility. We'll set that to a side. That would be quite catastrophic were it to happen. Let's say we have a scenario in which we have a continued temporary suspension of the debt ceiling, negotiations go on, and this crisis and impasse continues on for months. I think what you're likely to maybe see is that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in the markets. Bond yields might continue to go up. We can see that bond yields tend to increase as they approach one of the latter, what we call states of possible defaults. And there's just going to be a lot of uncertainty and volatility in the markets. You might see a demand decline in consumer-facing industry. And then another risk that happened actually for real back in the early 2010s was that the US credit ratings were downgraded for the first time ever. Now, this didn't happen because of a default. This just happened because the rating agencies saw all this political tomfoolery and decided that it presented too much of a risk. And of course, the risk of that happening, I think, is real should this continue to go on and on and on. And that will lead to the knock-on effect of higher borrowing prices, which will affect high capex industries and industries that have lots of debt. So I think those are things to keep an eye out for. And businesses would be prudent to keep a watch out on the US government spending, especially during divided government when these crises might crop up.
Thank you very much for watching. Remember, please, before you leave, to like this video, and we also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you have not yet done so. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.